Good evening and a really, really warm welcome. And it's amazing to see such a full venue this evening. If you've never been to Cafe Theology before, a special welcome to you. Cafe Theology is a joint initiative run between the chaplaincy of the University of Reading and the Diocese of Oxford, and it's our mission to bring theological ideas or theologians into the public domain to share their ideas and to give people who don't study theology a chance to ask questions about what their thinking is and to share their own thoughts too. We normally meet twice a term, and at the moment we're hybrid, so hi to Zoom people. Zoom people, we can't hear you, but if you write comments in the chat, Susie will be able to read them when it comes to the Q&A. We are videoing this event, but we'll only share, with Jay's permission, just the first bit of the talk rather than the Q&A at the end. So none of you will be on the video. So this evening, apologies for the late start. They were a little overwhelmed and only had one waiter. And there are lots of people in the room, so that's a testament to Jay, and I think probably tells you already how much you are valued in your coming here. I'm just going to read the back of Jay's book. Jay Hulme is a transgender poet, performer, educator and speaker with a love of ancient church buildings that led him to a sudden and life-changing encounter with the God that he never believed in. A little more background, Jay's worked with numerous organisations in promoting diversity in the media and literature. His poetry book for young adults, Clouds Cannot Cover Us, was nominated for the Carnegie Medal. He's contributor to the Book of Queer Prophets, and his poems have been published in various anthologies for children and adults. He's currently the poet in residence. Is it still true that Poets Church?
Yeah,
St. Giles-in-the-Fields.
I haven't been for far too long. Me and Tom need to sort that out. But you know, I still got the title. I just don't do the work. That's very poet of me.
So I think I've forgotten what the title of this talk is now. Queerness, poetry, theology.
I don't know.
Something like that. And just a little kind of trigger warning. Some of the stuff that you might hear tonight might just make you twitch a bit. That's okay. That's fine. Just note that. If you're going to express something, don't make it personal. We're humans here. We try and treat each other with love and compassion. We're trying to be Christian. So gentleness abounds. Without further ado, for about 45 minutes talk with some poetry and then Q&A, let's welcome Jay Hulme.
Hello, I am Jay Hulme. I have a job which is poet, which is a really stupid job. But as I always say, you know, we don't remember the accountants of ancient Greece. So I think it's a necessary job, particularly in times such as these. I grew up in Leicester. I do not expect a whoop for that. It is just no. You know how everyone hates their hometowns? It's a big feeling for me. And I went to uni, and then somehow I ended up back there. And now I'm like assistant church warden of this really old church, so I can't leave. I have responsibilities. So I grew up in Leicester, and the main thing to know about Leicester is that it was the first city, aside from London, to be less than 50% white British in the UK demographically. And the main non-Christian, non-atheist religion in Leicester is Hinduism. So the big thing is Diwali. I grew up about half a mile away from what's called the Golden Mile, which is where they have the biggest Diwali celebrations outside of Asia. And it's really great. And I grew up doing that. And the thing with Leicester is that because of that demographic, as well as doing Christmas and Christmas plays at primary school, we also did Diwali. And we did the story of Rama and Sita. And so it was quite an interesting faith experience. My parents were they were very much part of that hippie 80s, move away from the norm. We don't like religion. We're going to be bikers and do lots of drugs and wear strange clothes that they now sell at music festivals because they never grew up. And so my parents were sort of, it wasn't that they weren't Christian, it was that they didn't like Christianity because of what it stood for them as part of their countercultural thing. So I was brought up with without any real views of Christianity other than it was negative. and this strange connection with Hinduism. And one of my favorite stories as a child is that, so we did the Diwali play, and we did the Christmas play, and they're very close together. We've just had Diwali. So in my mind, they were very close. You do it in the same school year. And if nobody has explained Christianity to you and the meaning of the Christmas story to you, as a sort of 5-year-old child, given the choice between 7-headed demon kidnaps princess in woods who is then saved by monkey army, and woman has baby, there is one that sort of speaks to you more. And so my perception of Christianity was just thought it was sort of homophobic and boring. And then I went to university, and that didn't really change. But throughout my childhood, I'd been obsessed with church buildings. My parents went to watch motorbike racing all over the world. And the main thing to do at that time of the guy who was winning all the time was Italian. And you had to go and see him win at his home circuit. So we would go to Italy. And to take your kid out of school during term time, you had to have a reason. And rather than come up with a real reason, they lied. And they said that they were, taking me to see these great works of art in Italy, when really they were taking me to sit next to a motorbike track in the sweltering heat. And I'm not into sports, oddly enough, now as a grown-up. And the first time they did this, I snitched on them, and I told everybody that I just sat next to a motorbike track. So the next year they had to take me to see all of the great sort of art of Italy. And the places that are free to get into are churches. They weren't going to pay to get into a museum, but the churches were free. So they took me to see all of these church buildings full of this, incredible art. So as a small child, I saw the Duomo, the Leaning Tower, although you're not allowed to climb it until you're 14, which I was really mad about because I love climbing tall buildings. And at the time I was under 14. And so I saw all of these things, and I felt this connection with it. Even back in the UK, I would feel these connections, this sort of call to church buildings. And I went away to university, and I kept having this call to church buildings. But at the same time, I'd come out of trans, I was sort of navigating that. And what I found really, really interesting was that the more I grew into myself, the more I was able to transition, the more I was able to become fully who I am, the bigger the call towards church buildings got, which is really weird when you think about the way most queer people feel towards church buildings if they're not Christian. And I kept feeling this call. And one night I was stood outside Durham Cathedral. And when I worked in Durham, I had this deal with the people who paid me, the poets that I was training in Durham, that they could pay me less than my normal fee if they never scheduled me during Evensong at Durham Cathedral. But I wasn't Christian. I just really liked the music and the building and the vibes, honestly, right? And I'd been to Evensong, and I was talking to this poet who was deciding that they didn't want to be a poet, and I was like, that is entirely fine. Become a lawyer and then give your money to poets. And he was like, I'm so sorry. I'm like, it's fine. I was like absolving him on this bridge. And it was almost it was 2019. It was in November 2019. It was almost, we've just passed the anniversary. And during the service beforehand, I'd been sitting in the cathedral. And I am a foul-mouthed man. And during the sort of organ voluntary, I was sat there, and I distinctly remember staring sort of vaguely at the wall, because you were sat in the choir stalls, and being like, look, God, mate, now, come on. All right. I am a poet. I feel strong feelings for a living, right? You can't keep doing this to me. Either do a thing or F off. And so we were sat on this bridge, and I watched a boy jump into a river and live. And I was like, do a thing or F off. And then the next night I stole a Bible from a theological college, as one does. And then there was a worldwide plague. So I read the Bible cover to cover multiple times, locked in a room alone during the plague. And Leicester was hit really, really badly. So I emailed this priest, because I decided that you could just be a Christian without knowing any Christians, right? It's really easy. I'd just go to cathedrals and never get involved with Christianity as a thing, right? You could just believe in God and not actually be a Christian. It was going to be fine. But then I was locked in a room alone with a Bible, and I realized it was really hard to be Christian on your own. So I emailed this priest, and I was like, hi, God did a thing. How do I join the church? It's illegal to do anything. We've been locked down for a year. And she was like, I don't know, let's meet in a park because that's legal and we'll talk about God. And while I was going insane, locked in a room and walking around a park, talking about God and very slowly joining this church, which I'm now responsible for making not fall down, I wrote this book. And I couldn't write it now because it's really it fits in that time. And I'm going to do some poems from it because I've talked way too much. So we're going to skip through the plague poems because they're really sad. And it's a series of poems that I wrote during the lockdown. And every day I would write a poem. And my deal was that I wouldn't be allowed on Twitter until I'd written a poem. And you know what? It turns out that when you try and motivate yourself, you actually do work, which is something I've never done before. Who knew? If you actually try and work happens.
It's called adulting. It creeps up on you.
And no, I'm a poet, so that's never going to happen. So one of the things that I did was I was baptized just in between two lockdowns in October 2020. And we knew that Leicester was going to get hit by another lockdown, and we'd just been brought out of it. So we emergency planned this baptism in a sort of a 2-week spread. And as previously mentioned, most of my friends are not Christian. And so, but I thought, it's important for you to be here. You've supported me throughout so much of my life. If you want to come, no pressure. So there were more witches and atheists at my baptism than Christians, and they were all really supportive. But what was really important to me was that people came who had sort of sworn off churches for life, right? And this poem is about one of those, and how important it was for me that he came. It's called Atheist Out of Necessity. I make sure he is seated by the door, kept ajar in case he needs to run. Brother, you are not alone in this. The church has an empire of wrongs weaved into its being, and sometimes there is no going back. But I found God in these shivering pages, and they're better than this. Better than petty politics, bishops in parliament, homeless hunched in church doorways, better than the bleak bigots bellowing bullshit in town centres and boys' bedrooms and behind blocked up doorways built up as if to say there is no way out. Not as you, not like this. Become normal. When was God ever normal? When did God ever make a rational decision? Tell me, where in the Bible is sanity? It must be well hidden, for I've read it a dozen times and all I see is beauty. I see wonder and love and holy, holy, holy chaos. I see boys becoming bearers of a new way of being, miracles from dirt beside seas and in cities. Where in the mountains of Galilee did you see normality? I saw God with the outcasts on dusty roads, and now I'm here in this church making watery oaths, and he's there by the door, headphones on, blocking out the sermon for his own sanity. Once choir boy, now atheist out of necessity, but still here for me. And when you think of his presence like that, isn't it holy? During like 2 hours, it was a big deal. So I while I was doing this sort of lockdown Christian insane thing, I had this whole thing about holiness, and there was a plague going on, and so finding the holy in bleak things and in sad things. I was trapped in this city. The walk to get to my church, you would walk through these. There's an area of Leicester called Frog Island, which is all of the old factories that are sort of half falling into this polluted canal. And I would wend my way through these abandoned streets to get to church. And that sort of connected with God for me. And I was like, if I can see God here, God is everywhere, which is like a logical thing, right? But I think sometimes we miss it. Sometimes we don't internalize it. And so I wrote this. If God is everywhere, then everywhere is holy. Everything is holy. Everyone is holy. The blaspheming tongue, holy. The maze of streets, holy. The broken streetlight that flickers on at 2 a.m. to welcome home the dying, it too is holy. The homeless are prophets and saints as much as these bones and fragments. Treat them with reverence and love them, for they are holy as any other. I am holy. You are holy. The spit that flecks your lips as you curse out a stranger is disgusting, but holy. We are disgusting, but holy. When we leave strangers to die, we are leaving the holy. When we abandon the lost, we abandon the holy. Take your neighbor in hand. Lead them to a crowded A&E. See the doctors pull on their gloves. The gloves are holy. The hospital is holy. The cracked linoleum, a buzzing vending machine, holy, holy, holy. To save a life is holy. All life is holy. Lord, even death can be holy when a person is ready to go. So I was getting really religious, and I joined this church. It was really, really gay, because it doesn't have anybody living in its parish. So since the 1980s, it's just got gayer and gayer and gayer. And then I realized that some people weren't into that as a concept, God getting gayer and gayer and gayer. And I did a little event last night where we talked about poems in depth. And I often teach, when I teach in schools, I get the kids to write list poems, which are just poems that come in list form, because it's really easy. And you can be really sure of yourself. And I think young people in particular, when it comes to writing, they're so unsure. They're always like, is it okay? And I'm like, you're being creative. It's all okay. And so, but also people who are wrong are really sure of themselves, right? Like, I think the more sure you are, the more you should be concerned that you're wrong. You know, I'm like, God loves gay people. I'm fairly certain, but you know, what, I mean, that's what I feel, right? Who knows? Whereas the people who aren't into that are like, we are correct. We have spoken to Jesus Christ himself, and I know exactly what he said to me, like when I was in my bath last Tuesday. So I wrote a poem that's really short and really wrong. And it's sort of about how we see things. I think someone very wise once said to me that we pick up the Bible and we use it as a reference book. We look for what we already expect to find. We already know what's in it. We don't read it wondering what we're going to find. So this poem's called God is a Capitalist. God's on Spotify now. God's on YouTube. God's on Netflix. God's doing a series on Amazon Prime. God is a capitalist. God cuts down forests to print Bibles. God puts palm oil in the bake sale. God wraps plastic around the hosts. God wants injustice instead of protests. God wants nukes and executions. God kills the innocent and says they're guilty. God hates kindness, calls it weakness. God sings hymns based on sermons, based on books, based on Bibles, based on old mistranslations. God got lost in this translation. So, you know, I have strong opinions about things, generally in life. But what can you do? Do I want the one about nuns? No. So during lockdown, I had this problem in which Leicester was in lockdown for over a year and everything was closed and boring. And you have to leave the house, right? Or you go completely insane. So I would just walk around graveyards a lot. Like the graveyards were open. There's stuff to read there, the gravestones. You can treat it like an art park. It's fine. So I would just wander around these old dilapidated graveyards, sort of these Victorian with the big angel statues, you know. And I was like, some of you are going to have been trans, but we just don't know it, and you didn't have the language. So I wrote a poem about it, because that's what I do. And it's called Seeking Trans Ancestors in Old Provincial Graveyards. The dead are calling out again. I heard their names the other day, rarely spoken beyond the edge of the graveyard. Unconsecrated ground cannot hold them for long. There are names and empty syllables until the day breaks. Every day breaks like a man, and every night falls like a woman. And the dawn arises, and the moon in the daytimes hangs silent and awkward like the rest who never belonged. And they hang pride flags outside the churches now. And the homophobes claim it's God's rainbow. And the queers claim it's our rainbow. And God claims all of us anyway, long before we are born. In the wind, I hear the names again. Their echoes are all the syllables we've never quite said. Dead, undead, dead, undead, dead, undead. Until the daybreak, I walk the church line, drag my feet over endless graves, speak the names, all these empty names. Those too weathered to read, I speak loudest of all. A response call. Joshua, Edward, Mary, beloved of her family, born, lived, died, a date, a promise, a fall. I rarely do this one, but I really quite like it. People often say to me, oh, you should write some poems about like the worst stuff in church, like the rats that always seem to get into old churches. And I'm like, I have done. Have you not read my entire collected works? I have a weird thing about God and pigeons, which we can talk about later if you want. But I also think, you know, we should be nice to not every church, but most old churches in city centres have the rat story. And at St. Nick's, ours is that for the first time ever, our priest decided to do a big contemplative service around Lent, Easter, that kind of time, can't remember now. And we were all like meditative in the dark with just candles, eyes closed, and sort of weird chimey music as we like followed the life of Jesus. And then somebody started screaming at the back because a rat had run over her feet and she jumped up onto the back of the pew. And my priest was like, that's a sign, never doing this kind of service again. So this is my poem about church rats. The rats attend church sometimes, sat at the back in shifting lines. Who needs church mice when you can go bigger? Who needs church mice when the church rats come shining out the canal every Sunday? Sit themselves on the prayer books, chitter along to the hymns, all creatures of our God and King, eyes wide and clever, watching everything. So I have an obsession with cathedrals. They're the best buildings on earth. Fight me about it later. I believe there's a car park. We can meet up, fist fight, that kind of thing. You're wrong, I'll win. And I have a huge thing about cathedrals because I think that cathedrals, people often say the cathedrals represent the body of Christ, right? And I think that I have a long rant about how that's true. There's like a web essay about it. But I think that the way that we look at cathedrals is the way we should look at ourselves. We're obsessed with how beautiful and awe-inspiring cathedrals are, but they were made by people. And we look at ourselves and all we ever see are the flaws, but we were made by God. And particularly as a trans person, something that really speaks to me about cathedrals is that people think that they're static and perfect and all in one style and beautiful. And they were knocked down and rebuilt in 500 different styles about 400 different times for various different purposes. And as a trans person, having one end of the cathedral be a completely different architectural style to the other end of the cathedral really speaks to me. So I wrote a poem about how trans people are cathedrals. And if you take anything from tonight, I think it is to remember that. So one of my favorite Archbishop Desmond Tutu quotes ever is that he said, if we genuflect to recognize the presence of God, the least we should do is genuflect towards one another. And I think a sort of twist on that for me is that if we stare in awe and wonder and reverence at these ancient buildings, the least we should do is look with those same eyes upon ourselves and each other. So this poem is kind of about that, and it's called This Body. This body is a cathedral holier than those made by human hands. This body is a cathedral holier than those made by human hands. This body is undergoing a personal reformation. This body is enduring a modern iconoclasm. This body is being remade in a new shade of beauty. This body is altering its archways. This body is reverting old changes. This body is fixing the damage. This body is filled with prayer. This body holds relics of saints. This body turns sunlight to statuary. This body is built out of bondage. This body is still a cathedral. This body is still holy. This body is filled with worship. We sense these shattered bones. So I love cathedrals, so I'm just going to do another cathedral poem. And You know, I could explain it, but I'm a bird watcher, only the bird is a cathedral, and it's about bird song, but it's not, because it's about a cathedral, and it's called Cathedral Song. It is night, and I am watching the cathedral. Like an avid twitcher, I identify every wing. Look, as she sits. See the shadows of the floodlights, the curved details, that Romanesque flourish, slicing into Gothic, into grandeur, into gone. She's flying into dreams again. Each stone a compendium of prayer. First formed by the hands of men long dead, yet still she speaks. Song and silence synthesized into the sound of the sacred, she is an instrument of interpolation. An organ built entirely of time. Each life that is lived adds syllables to centuries of song. Like any good twitcher I see by silhouette, move slowly so as to not scare her off. Listen closely now. Each cathedral sings with a slightly different sound. So the sort of end part of this book gets quite weird, as was mentioned to me. The new one's going to be so much weirder. And I'm a firm believer that poetry should be accessible and not in the way that people say it with sort of a curled lip and oh, that's so accessible. But in a way that the thing that turns a lot of people off of poetry is that you look at it and there is only the really deep stuff. And there is no way to get access to that if you're not confident about poetry. And it just immediately makes people feel like there is a barrier between them and understanding. And I don't think the poem is ever realized until a person experiences it. I often say that the poem is not the words on the page, the poem is what you feel when you read it, when you hear it. And in that way, a poem is different for every single person who experiences it, because poetry is such an individual experience, because the brevity of it, but also the depth of it, means that it is entirely in insinuation and implication. And that depends on the person who's experiencing it. So in this book, I did a series of poems, which I when I was laying it out, I called J-Whip, or Jesus in Weird Places. And it wasn't just Jesus, it was various biblical figures, but it's this idea of taking God, Jesus, Jonah, and putting them in places, and then using that to make a comment. It enables people to understand the poem, or at least have some feeling of the poem, because it doesn't matter what the inner words of the poem are. If you feel confident enough, you can dig to those, but on the surface, it is so-and-so is in this place, which makes it a lot easier. And so we're getting to this series, and I'm going to do you one from that, and it's going to be a nice weird one, just to see the rest of them seem better. So one of my favorite stories from reading the Bible cover to cover in a room alone during a plague is that I knew nothing about the Bible at all. I was completely insulated from the culture. I didn't even know what day Christmas was, right? Like, insulated is not the word. I thought David and Goliath was like Greek mythology with rubbish names. And genuinely shocked when I found that one in the Bible. But I got to Jonah and I was like, I know this one, Jonah and the whale, I've got it, I know it. And I read the whole thing, and I had the NRSV, in which it is translated as big fish, because it's not a whale. But I read the whole thing, so mad that there wasn't a whale, that when I got to the end, I was like, where's the whale? And I Google it, and I find out, it's a translation thing. But I realized that I was so hung up on not finding what I expected to find there that I missed the whole point of the book of Jonah, and I had to go back and reread it. And I think we do that with the Bible quite a lot. So I wrote a poem kind of about that, in which I heckled Jonah at a book signing in a bookstore. It's probably a Waterstones, because you wouldn't heckle anyone at a local independent. That would be rude. I'm standing at the back of the bookstore. Jonah is signing copies of his autobiography. The miraculous isn't all it's cracked up to be. Why can't they see it? It's just a big fish. I shout from the doorway. Just one massive fish. Stop saying it's a whale. Jonah looks up at me, slips the lid of his pen from his lips and cracks a smile. And what is it, do you think, about fish that would make this any less of a miracle? So I have an obsession with, who doesn't love the Eucharist? You know, normal people, I assume. But I have like an obsession with hands. It's a poet thing. Every poet tends to have this weird hand thing. There's something about it being the way in which most of us interact with the world. It sort of speaks to us and all that weird stuff. So I got really into like hand gestures at the Eucharist. There was nothing else to do. There was a plague on. Why not weirdly stare at priests as a hobby? And the sort of up and out movement really got me. It appears in a number of poems in this collection. I'm going to do 2 of them now. And one is Up and Out in Gethsemane. And I don't know where Ross has disappeared to, but I owe my life to Ross for explaining how that's pronounced before I finished writing the poem, because I was doing it all wrong and the rhythm would have been way off. And I'm not going to tell you how I was pronouncing it. So there's a garden named Gethsemane with olive trees tangled like thorns, each branch crooked, reaching up and out at the same time, like every one of our prayers, alternating syllables edged between heaven and earth. One day a man came and his prayers cradled all of creation before falling back into himself, up and out at the same time. And he was raised up and out at the same time, and we were saved up and out at the same time, replayed. A scrap of bread in the hands of a priest who will never see this garden. Up and out, raised and distributed like prayer. All of us rising and reaching, edged between heaven and earth. So I was hung up on that hand movement. And then somebody on Twitter tweeted about in persona Christian. I was like, yo, what's that? So I Googled it. I went on Wikipedia, because that's what you do these days when you don't know something. And basically, it's this theological concept that some people have, that during the Eucharist, the priest stands in the place of Jesus and acts as Jesus. And I thought, yo, that's got to be massive pressure, right? Now you're waking up on a Sunday morning, the rest of us are like, oh, we've got to get to church for 9 a.m. The priest got to be like, oh, I've got to be Jesus by 9 a.m. Like, ooh. So I wrote a poem that's about humanity and priestliness and everything, the Eucharist, you know, called In Persona Christi, because I'm rubbish at titles. So, you know, that was a gimme, so I used it. The priest is texting me at 2 a.m. The priest is texting me and he is lonely and he is lovely and it is dark. The priest is texting at 2 a.m. and remembering when he wasn't a priest, remembering when he didn't believe. The priest is texting me and saying, tomorrow I have to be Jesus. That's what they say about priests, you know, they say we stand in for Jesus. Can you imagine the pressure? I imagine him becoming Jesus. Imagine him slipping into scarred skin, hands curling gently around a chisel, around another hand, around the edges of the dying. I imagine him reaching out and up and lifting the death clean out of us. I imagine that the edges of his vestments are lined with dirt from the walk, you know, from the journey. And I imagine him holding himself in his own palm, broken now and whole, putting himself into himself, breaking himself into pieces in front of a crowd. He tears his body in two, saying, these crumbs, they are me, and these hands, they are me, and these people, they are me, and this spirit, it is me, and this God, it is me, and this me, I am more me than me, but not less. And he holds himself at the altar, placing himself into others, placing himself into others, placing himself into himself, every piece of himself, until there's a moment where he stands in a sea of silence, and knows it has all been consumed. So I love poems set in places. So we're going to do another weird Jesus in Weird Places poem. So it's very short. I did a degree in English literature and journalism. I turned up to almost none of the lessons because I was too busy being a poet, which is why I chose a bad university, so I'd still graduate. But doing English literature and journalism, the first thing you do on your first day of journalism is they send you out to get vox pops, which is where they ask people who don't know what they're talking about to have an opinion on something really important, and then they put it on the news. And I was like, what if we did that at the crucifixion? What if we asked like the soldier who crucified Christ in like a vox pop style? So I wrote a poem about it. It's called Vox Pops from Golgotha. When the temple cracked, I cried out, having been halfway to laughing when it happened. Spears slung low and dripping this cooling blood. But it's a living, I guess. It's a living. And in 10 years of crucifying criminals, I only killed God once. So following on from that theme, you know, Jesus is dead now, let's do the next poem where he comes back. And it's one of the first ones I wrote for this collection. Well, no, but it's the first one I wrote and I was like, oh, there's a collection of this. I've been writing weird Jesus poems. And it's called Mary Magdalene and the Gardener. And I wrote it when I was getting ready for baptism and I was having this complete nonsense breakdown. I have this problem where I think that I am the most important person on earth and everything revolves around me and all of my problems are the worst problems that have ever been, and clearly nobody has suffered like me. And I'm either the worst or the best, there is no in between. And it drives my clergy mad. They're like, Jay, you are not God. And I'm like, I know, I am the worst. Like, do you have a middle setting? Absolutely not. I'm like a slow cooker. There is only high and low. So I was getting stressed about baptism. And there was something about how in John, Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene thinks that Jesus is the gardener, and it gave me this whole thing about, was it because he had dirt on his hands, and oh, I have dirt on my hands, and aren't I terrible? But I wrote this poem, and it's about that, but it's not about that at all. This poem. At first, Mary thought he was a gardener, this miraculous son. She saw the dirt under his nails, through the tears in her eyes, and saw not the grave, but the bringer of life. And how was she wrong then? This woman wrapped in grief, who saw the dirt of a borrowed tomb and thought at first of things which bloomed, which turned their heads to the sun and burst into joyous hope. So we're doing stories about Jesus' life. Let's do The Carpenter, which is one of the last poems I wrote. One of your favorites. It's one of the last poems I wrote for this book. And I wrote it because everybody always writes about and gets obsessed about Mary, right? Like it takes two to raise somebody. And clearly Jesus came out all right. So Joseph did some good. And back then, fatherhood was a big thing. You know, you have a son, the son takes on your trade, you expect lots of them. Joseph has a son who, according to an angel, is going to do all of these wondrous things, who he willingly adopts in a world that's very much bloodline dependent. How do you teach your child, right? You're preparing your child for the world, and they've just gone, ha ha. And Joseph went, yeah, cool. And if you look at art, there's quite a lot of depictions of Joseph with the child Jesus, who doesn't really appear in the Bible, but the child Jesus doing sort of carpentry and hanging out and learning the trade. And there are these things, you know, they say, oh, that's the carpenter. There is this sense that Jesus did work as a carpenter. And I was obsessed with the idea of the fact that Jesus, his main connection with his father would have been, you know, the fact his father was a carpenter, and he would have sat with him while he created things and learned the trade, and then he took that on. He spent his whole life. The whole point of carpentry is that you create life, you create beauty from death, right? You get the dead wood and you create something lovely or useful or important. And you use wood and nails. and Jesus is crucified using wood and nails and creates from death something deep and important and new. So I wrote a poem about it called The Carpenter, and it's quite short. He knew his son would outshine him from the beginning, so taught this child the only thing he could, the skill of taking blades and wood and turning death into something else entirely. So we're doing weird, Jesus in weird places and stuff. And one of my favorites is, well, I don't know. I have sort of like 6 or 7 favorites in this book that I circle between, and this is one of those as candidates for one of my favorite poems in this book. And it's the temptation of Christ, only Jesus is in a car park and we are the devil. And we are trying to lure Jesus away from the places of the world and lock him away in churches and cathedrals. And it does slightly come out of that whole, we were locked out of churches, how do we be Christian panic that happened during COVID. And also the fact that due to a quirk of urban planning, most cities with a cathedral have a multi-storey car park that overlooks the cathedral. I don't know if you've noticed, but most cities do. I quite enjoy it. The one in Bristol is particularly dramatic. It's really high up on this sort, and you look down over the whole city and see the cathedral. Anyway, in my head, that's where this is set. But you can pick your favourite multi-storey car park. Because if it's in a cathedral city, you can probably see the cathedral. Jesus sits on the edge of the car park. Robes hitched up to his knees, he swings his legs to and fro against the concrete. I say, Lord, you'll scrape your skin on these stones. My son, he says, for he calls me son, unlike any father I've had before. If death could not best these bones, why would this? I point out the cathedral in the distance. See that house we may do? 1,000 years past, there's a throne for you there, and a man who keeps it warm. Shall we go? He doesn't speak, just looks out at the city. A car backfires. A baby cries. And the sunset lights his flyaway hairs like a shining circle of thorns. I'm going to end with the 2 gayest poems in the book full of gay poems. This one got me in loads of trouble because people have opinions about Jesus, apparently, who knew? I was sitting in the choir stalls at St. Nick's and I was like, this is a poem people need. I'd been reading Jesus, the woman with the hemorrhage, and thinking about how all of the healings that Jesus does, he doesn't heal the affliction because the affliction needs healing. He heals the afflictions so that people can be in society and be themselves. And the woman with the hemorrhage is pushed out of society, and by healing her, he enables her to go back. And it is that the healing is Jesus heals the ostracism as much as he heals the physical problem. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about how so many people discovering that my church, which is really gay, existed because I tweet about it too much. Just knowing that it existed was sort of healing for people. So I wrote a poem about Jesus in a gay bar, in which it riffs on the woman with the hemorrhage. And in fact, Jesus doesn't heal the kid who wants to be healed of being queer, because being queer doesn't need healing. And in doing so, he heals the thing that made the kid come and ask for healing in the first place. Which is, that internalized homophobia and self-hatred. So I wrote this poem. People got very, very mad about it because it's called Jesus at the Gay Bar. And it goes like this. He's here in the midst of it, right at the center of the dance floor. Robes hitched up to his knees to make it easy to spin. At some point in the evening, a boy will touch the hem of his robe and beg to be healed. Beg to be anything other than this. And he will reach his arms out, sweat damp and weary from dance. He'll cup this boy's face in his hand and say, my beautiful child, there is nothing in this heart of yours that ever needs to be healed. So I'm going to end with a poem that started out as a tweet thread, to be honest with you. Again, I've got a problem. And it's Beatitudes for a Queerer Church. And I think it's a call and a proposition and a maybe and a prayer, which is why I was asked to end with it. Blessed are the outcasts, the ostracized, the outsiders. Blessed are the scared, the scarred, the silent. Blessed are the broken, for they are not broken. Blessed are the hated, for they are not worthy of hate. Blessed are those who try, those who transform, who transition. Blessed are the closeted. God sees you shine anyway. Blessed are the queers, who love creation enough to live the truth of it, despite a world that tells them they cannot. And blessed are those who believe themselves unworthy of blessing. What inconceivable wonders you hold.
Ladies and gentlemen, give a hand to Jay Hulme.